some things we may not acknowledge that we have to have help with, but we do. But then there are those things that we do acknowledge. There's those things that we shoot up, like the Titanic, they said shot them flares, said, hey, we sinking here. There's things in life where we do shoot the flares up, and we say, God, I know. I may not have knew about this other stuff, Lord, that you helped me with, but this right here is the case, God. I know that this particular item in my life, I'm insufficient. I'm insufficient. I think about some characters in the Bible. I like to, when we went just last month to see David up at the Sight and Sound Theater, it didn't take long to realize, whether you like the story of David, the whole story of his life, but in 2 Samuel, when David went up against Goliath, David was a young man. And he was going up, listen, a giant that was, twice his height, 5 times his size. I'm talking about the head of his spear, they say weighed like 80 pounds. We wouldn't have been able to carry hardly his armor and stuff would have been overwhelming. You couldn't even carry it. In that David in the Sight and Sound Theater, though, they literally had these giants. They had built them, and they were, it was pretty amazing. But you know what? You know what happened? This is what David said, okay? David said, I'm coming to you, Goliath, in the name of the Lord of hosts. You know what? I believe David understood when 2 Samuel, I think David understood that pound for pound, he was no match for Goliath. Really, you could think in terms of Goliath being able to sort of take David and just kind of do this right here, and he'd go like flying 100 yards to the left, Or listen, he could take his sword and just sort of, cut him about 20 different ways like a sushi roll. I'm just saying, in David's mind, David understood before he went into battle with Goliath that he was going to be very insufficient to defeat Goliath on his own. There were people more equipped and more battle-clad in the Israeli army than David was. You get it? There were people that had been to war much longer than David had ever, because he had never. There was people that understood battles a lot better than David at this point. But David is the only one that said, hey, I'm not going to battle Goliath. I'm going to battle him in the name of the Lord, and the Lord will fight for me. And guess what? In verse 47 of 2 Samuel chapter 17, and all this assembly, this is what David said, shall know that the Lord saveth not with sword and spear, for the battle is the Lord's, and he will give you into our hands. You understand what David went into this thing with? David went into the battle knowing he was insufficient, but he was relying upon the sufficiency of God. God, listen, what it was, if you mounted all of David up, he wasn't big enough to beat Goliath. But whenever David said, it's not just me, but it's the Lord through me, all of a sudden, listen, God makes up the difference. And so insufficiency becomes sufficient when the Lord is at play, when the Lord is at work. And so we look at David and we say, hey, yeah, David, he was insufficient on his own. But boy, listen, when the Lord got in there, who ended up winning? Yeah, the rock sunk into the giant's forehead. Hey, yeah, David did take the giant's own sword and cut his head off. Yeah, listen, Israel won that day because the battle was the Lord's and it was not theirs. I think about, we've been studying the book of Mark on Wednesday nights, and of course we've many weeks past this particular point. But when we look at Mark chapter 5, we see the woman here who had been sick. In fact, she'd been sick for almost 12 years, and she was none the better. Now listen to me, she was none the better. In fact, listen, she was worse than she was, and also on top of that, she was broke now because everybody had took advantage of her, and now she had no money, and she was still as sick as she was. But what do we hear? We hear Jesus is coming by. And listen, Jesus is the one who has made up the difference in other people's lives. I mean, Jesus, they couldn't see, but yet when Jesus met them, they could see. They couldn't walk, but when Jesus met them, they could walk. They had devils, but when Jesus left, they were sitting sane in the right mind. I mean, on and on. They had storms, but when Jesus met them, the storms went away. Everything was at peace and calm. And so on we go, where this lady, this woman who is now insufficient, not only in her funds, but also in her physical ability, here's Jesus is coming by, and she wants to, she simply wants to touch the hem of his garment. You know, they did a message actually on the National Association was going the extra mile this year. That was the theme. And part of one of the sermons was talking about this woman. And, you know, you get in the background of this lady. She was ceremonially unclean. She wasn't supposed to be out in a crowd. She would have been looked at as, listen, someone who just was cast to the side at this point. I mean, every way this lady should have never been where she was. She didn't want nobody to know where she was. She was in a crowd where she would not. I mean, if the religious leaders saw her, they would have killed her. I mean, she should have never been doing what she was doing. But what she was trying to do was simply touch the hem of him whom she had heard about's garment. She knew that, listen, she was insufficient, but he was all sufficient, and she just needed to touch the hem of his garment. She didn't want to make any, to hide herself, to go through the crowd, to finally just touch his garment, and to know immediately when she touched his garment that she was made sufficient. The insufficient now is sufficient. Why? Because she touched Jesus. And that's in Mark chapter 5, verses 24 through 29. Get this. It says that whenever she touched him, she knew that her healing had took place. And I didn't put the verses in there, but listen to me. Basically what it said is, Jesus said, okay, who touched me? Who touched me? You know, it's comforting to know that nobody will ever come Jesus' way that he doesn't acknowledge or know. He knows where you are. He knows where you are in proximity to him. He knows where you are in your relationship, whether you're in or out. He knows this woman in this gigantic crowd of people who are thronging him. I mean, listen, he knows her. And she says, the disciples are just amazed. Lord, everybody's touching you. No, but somebody had a purpose. Somebody was insufficient, and I just made them sufficient. And he turns around, and it's this woman. And not only, listen, does Jesus not rebuke her. The woman, thy faith, you're whole, you're whole. You see, when insufficiency meets the sufficient, all-sufficient Christ, it's no longer insufficient, but it's made complete. And so, yes, listen, David knew it, going into it, that he was insufficient. This woman knew she was insufficient in every possible way. She could never make up the gap on her own, but Jesus made it up for her. Abraham Lincoln said one time, I've been driven many times to my knees by the overwhelming conviction that I had nowhere else to go. My own wisdom and that of all about me seemed insufficient for the day. Church, let me tell you something. There's some things in life that you and I are going to go through, and we do go through them, and we're going to realize, whether you realize it on the front end or the back end, you're going to realize just how insufficient you are to handle it. I say this, it's a whole lot better to know your insufficiency going in than God have to wrestle it, listen, out of you and realize going out of it. There's situations sometimes that you go on in your family that you're insufficient to handle. That means that you can try all you want to try, but listen, your works and your ways will fall short. They are insufficient. Somebody said, preacher, what does that mean? That means it's simply out of your hands. It's not out of his hands, but it's out of your hands. It doesn't matter if that's a wayward child, grandchild, sibling, listen, somebody going through other issues personally, it's insufficient. We are insufficient to go in. And you go into it realizing you're insufficient. You can't change a person. Only the Lord can. You are insufficient to change the heart of a person. Listen, there are burdens that you're going to carry in life sometimes that you're insufficient to carry. I mean, what I mean by that is that burden, as you try to carry it, will carry you. It will drive you in the ground. You'll be like the old cartoons where, listen, he just keeps walking down and he's just going down till there ain't nothing left. He's under the ground. I mean, that's the way it works. You try to carry some things that you're simply insufficient to carry. It's called overload. It's whenever you put too much on something. You saw the old pictures, listen, sometimes of other countries where somebody don't want to make more than one trip. I saw it and I laughed so hard. They had this little old Toyota truck over in another foreign country. And Sam, you say you've seen it. And I guess the people were real good at stacking and packing. And the back of the truck, listen, they had it coming up 40 foot tall, 20 foot out the sides. It was tapped on there. The truck, listen, was about doing this right here, but they wasn't going to make but one trip. You see that thing? It's called overload, and that's what happens sometimes in life. Hey, you got a load you're not meant to carry. You try to carry it, but listen, what it does, it carries you right on into the ground. It'll load you up, and it'll weigh you down. You will spin and spin and spin. Listen, here's what will happen in life. When you carry a load that you can't carry, the load, when I say the load carries you, I mean it carries you. I mean, when it tilts, you tilt with it. When it goes this way, you go that way. You see, we told you there's a situation. I'll bring it up. I told a few of you Wednesday night. I found out about it. I found out about how a dump truck works and don't work. All right, so in the process of this pond digging adventure, it's going to be a book one day on what not to do, like how for me, okay? I am, by the way, let me just speak clearly. I am not a heavy equipment operator. All right? I am not a heavy equipment operator. Listen, I had a slap-on, full-on concussion at doing on a bulldozer. It about threw me slap out of it. My head caught, and listen, all I heard was crack, crack, crack. It took me 4 weeks to turn my head the right way. Y'all didn't know it. Listen, it was all about me. Listen, I was, oh, Lord. I had to call the Dr. Mortar at that time. I heard crack, crack, crack. I learned. See, I learned. I learned a valuable lesson, okay? But listen, I learned a lesson about carrying a load with a dump truck. I did. Now, I was warned, listen, that if the tailgate ain't open or something's wrong and you lift the dump truck, that very easily the load will carry you back with it. Y'all get that? That's pretty easy, right? Well, let me just tell you, okay? Let me just tell you. That's a true statement. Not necessarily that the back of the dump truck's not unlocked, because it is. But sometimes when you got real bad dirt like I do, and stuff it don't want to come out the truck. So whenever, listen, the truck, all right, is supposed to simply lift and dump everything out and everything's good and you drive off. But when it don't, there's the problem. You see, when you keep putting I say the burden, all right, when the weight keeps going back and it keeps going up and it don't go out, okay, there's a point, okay. I'm not an engineer, okay, but there's this point where everything starts to not be right, okay. You've reached your center of gravity and it's not where it needs to be, okay? And so what happens? Well, I'm going to tell you what happened, okay? Your preacher is back on a farm somewhere, and he's got a big old load of dirt that's not leaving the dump truck, and the dump truck just keeps on going right on up. And I feel like I'm getting ready to be launched into SpaceX. And, I mean, it's all going south because I was warned. He said, you know, this truck will flip over. I just didn't think that it would do just a complete back circle, okay? All right? But hey, once my heart got in rhythm and I understood, listen, that it wasn't going back down and that things was going to have to, I understood it. But it taught me a lesson, okay? Just let me be clear. It taught me a lesson. When I got whacked on the head in the bulldog, I learned a lesson, okay? I learned what to do, what not to do. I learned that the load, all right, if it's in the wrong, if you try to carry a load in the wrong place, okay, the load controls you. See, that load had me in. I mean, tires off the ground. I mean, listen, I'm done. It ain't going nowhere. And see, that's what happens whenever you carry a burden that you know you can't carry. The burden is carrying you. The burden's loaded you. You think you winning this thing. You're not winning. Listen, you are up in the air with your feet just like that, waving them and saying, hey, I can't go nowhere. I can't do nothing. You see, I learned, listen, when I called Tony and said, hey, we got a problem here, that I was insufficient, okay? I was insufficient. All right, I was insufficient. And when he finished laughing, he realized he was, but anyway, we'll move on. But I learned a lesson about weight and about load and how it can control you if it's in the wrong area. Hey, there is no load that you can carry, all right, that will not turn you one way or the other until you release it to the Lord. You get that? It doesn't take what I'm telling you is it doesn't take a whole lot of weight in life that you're trying to carry for you to realize that listen, it is guiding you and pulling you every which way it wants to. It doesn't take a lot to figure out. It'll do it. It'll control you. You're not controlling it. Humble yourselves. 1 Peter 5. Humble yourselves, therefore, under the mighty hand of God, that he may exalt you in due time, casting all your care upon him, for he careth for you. Church, let me tell you something, okay? I did learn this. Whenever we dumped those loads and it went off the back of the truck like it was supposed to, and the bed of that truck went down, the whole truck lifted. And when I drove off, it was like driving you felt like you was on cloud nine because the load was off. When it was carrying a load, everything was boggy. When the load was off, everything, you could turn it, it would move. It was just a whole lot better experience when the load was gone. Church, listen to me. That's what he said. He says, casting some of your cares. Isn't that what it says? Does it say that? Is that what it said? Oh, I'm sorry. That's a pretty big word, isn't it? Isn't that a big difference? He didn't say cast some of your cares that you're insufficient to carry. He said cast all of them. Because here's what I found out. I found out that your cares, you may think it's like a little snowball, but if that thing continues, it's like a magnet, and it attracts more cares, and it attracts more cares, and it attracts more weight, and then more cares, and more weight, and more weight, and more cares, and sooner or later, listen, you've went from a little snowball that you thought you could handle, you've went to a giant, listen, that you can't carry, nobody can carry. It's one of them Atlas balls that they use. And that's how it takes place. That's why he didn't say cast some, he said cast all. Why? Because God, all right, is all powerful, and he can carry it all. Did you know that? He can carry it all. He can handle it, listen, because you simply cannot. You weren't built for it. And so we go further and we say, we're insufficient, he's sufficient. When it comes to situations in family, when it comes to burdens that you're carrying, insufficient to sufficiency only happens through Jesus Christ. Sometimes our physical needs are insufficient to deal with. It's from a medicine to this or that, and the doctor says this and that, and you're trying to go back and forth. And listen, we talked about Saul/Paul this morning about the Damascus Road, but here's the deal. There was a time in Paul's life where he was dealing with some disabling ailment. I mean, they don't know. They speculated what it was, but he described it as a thorn in his side. Now, it was not literally a thorn in his side, okay? But it kept him, listen, at a particular place. He felt like it hindered him in doing some things. And so what did he do? He said, God, will you please remove this thorn? And he just poured his heart out to God. And then he poured out his heart to God again. And he said he prayed 3 times that God would just remove this, that he wasn't sufficient to carry. And what does God come back? He said, listen to me, buddy. He said, I love you, Paul, but I'm not going to remove it. I'm simply going to give you grace sufficient to handle it. Because it will always keep you where you need to be, and that is reliant upon me. And that was 2 Corinthians chapter 12, verses 7 through 9. And verse 9 says, my grace is sufficient for thee, for my strength is made perfect in weakness. Most gladly, therefore, will I rather glory in my infirmities, that the power of Christ may rest upon me. You know what? Powerful Christian Paul simply comes to the place where he says, hey, it's going to be with me. God's not going to take it away. But he said that he would always have grace sufficient for me to handle it. It'll always be okay. It'll be okay. You see, Paul insufficient, Christ sufficient. You work together and you've got sufficiency at his best. Church, when it comes to salvation, guess what? You're insufficient. Do you get that? I want you to do this. I want you to figure out a method or a plan that you think will work to save you from hell to heaven. And I want you to work on that plan and develop that plan and see how and see how it works. You say, preacher, that's ludicrous. It won't work. That's right. So will you work and try to get your way to heaven. So will good works outweighing bad works. So will, listen, you go to church, you say, hey, I won't come to church much, they will. But it's a false, it's a lie if you think coming to church. If you come and ding the bell every time you come to church and think that's your ticket to heaven. You see, what the Bible tells us is that we are insufficient to get to heaven on our own. That there is nothing that you and I can do. Listen, you can hoop and holler and you can pray. You can spend all your days praying. You can spend all your days and nights sitting on this front pew of this sanctuary. I open the church for you. You can sit in here and you can sit and meditate day and night. You won't get to heaven based on that meditation. You're insufficient to get to heaven on your own. That's why Jesus had to die. If Jesus didn't have to die, listen to me, if you could get there on your own, Jesus had not have died. Do you think God would have spared His only Son had there been another way? No. Hey, the only way that you and I can get to heaven is through the sufficiency of Christ and us understanding that we are insufficient to do it on our own. You know, the first step to getting saved is to realize that you can't save yourself, that you're but a sinner. Listen, if you are saved, it's going to be through the grace of God. And so salvation we are insufficient in salvation without the atoning death of Jesus Christ. There is nothing you can do to save yourself. It's all about Him, and it's not about you. Hey, mind you this, okay? I've sit here and I've told you, okay, you're insufficient. You're insufficient. You're insufficient because I am too. I'm with you. We're only insufficient on our own. We are sufficient with Jesus Christ. Did you get that? Hey, let me give you just 2 verses in closing. The first one is this, Philippians 4:13. What does it say in Philippians 4:13? Well, it'll be on the screen, but how about let's do a little responsive reading on this little baby, okay? I can do all things through Christ who strengthens me. Wait a minute now. Did it say I can do all things? It did. But did it ever say I can do all things, period? Did it say I can do all things on my own? I can do all things if I read enough books. I can do all things if I will do enough good works. I can do all things if I will build up and be stronger than I ever have in my life. I can do all things if I read through this set of encyclopedias, if I know everything off of Wikipedia, if I'm a good... No, it doesn't say that. It only says I can do all things if I go through Christ, and He will give you the strength to be able to do whatever it is you face in life. It is all things through Christ. But then we, go to another verse, and this will be our final verse for today, and it comes from 2 Corinthians chapter 3. Remember this, all right? If you don't remember anything else today, you and I are insufficient, but Christ is all sufficient. All right? And our salvation and our lives should be wrapped up in Him. If you're going to be anything and make anything, it is because you are hid in Christ. And He is all sufficient. And here's the last verses for today. 2 Corinthians chapter 3, verses 4 and 5. And such trust have we through Christ to Godward, not that we are sufficient of ourselves to think anything as of ourselves, but our sufficiency is of God. Church, what I'm telling you in closing today is, if there is a deficit to be made up in your life, Christ can make it up. If you tried to reach the top ring of that ladder on your own, you realize every jump you make, you get further away. Christ can make the difference. Church, He reaches down to where you are, and He pulls you up to where you need to be. And you become sufficient, not in your own power and own strength, but in Him. It doesn't matter this morning what it is that you got going on in your life. When you reach to the end of your rope, that's the only time you'll ever come to the place where you understand that your rope was useless on the whole deal. It needs to be Christ. Do you understand that? I hear people that say, I'm at the end of my rope. Listen to me. Then finally, when you're at the end of your rope, finally you'll realize that it's on Christ and Christ alone. Your rope, you see, your rope is irregardless to this deal. You can't, your rope, it doesn't go anywhere. All your rope does is like the law does. It tells you that you're insufficient. That's what the law does, by the way. Christ said it. He said the law is there to teach you that you can't keep all the law and that you're a lawbreaker. But grace is there to teach you that Christ is all sufficient and will make up the difference in your life. Hey, you got a problem you need fixing and you can't fix it. Christ is sufficient. Never seen a puzzle Christ couldn't put together. Never seen pieces that Christ can't put together. It's when we have to understand today in closing. Insufficiency. That's me. You can put it, listen, beside my name, okay? Insufficient. Period, exclamation point, wherever you want to put it. Christ sufficient. Christ sufficient. That's where it's at today. I'm going to ask you to stand with heads bowed and eyes closed. Again, I don't know where you are today, but I know where Christ wants you to be. Maybe you're here today and you say, preacher, I'm going through things in my life and I'm simply insufficient. I can't fix it, I can't do, but I know Jesus can. And so I'd ask you today, this altar's open. Maybe you just need to come and say, God, help me to realize my insufficiency and to learn to rely upon you. Paul said, when I'm weak, then I'm strong.
Without him I could do nothing. Without him I'd surely fail. Without him I would be drifting like a ship without a sail. Jesus, oh Jesus, do you know him today? Do not turn